Before I start this video, I would just like to point out quickly that my last video about how the Me Too movement and those over-concerned with political correctness are failing the girls in Telford has been demonetized by YouTube. As I mentioned in that video, nearly all of my videos have been demonetized, and this is not about money. Videos that are not monetized hardly ever show up in recommended viewing, either on the sidebar or a person's homepage, and this means even if my videos are relevant to what a viewer is actively seeking out, the chances of finding it are greatly reduced. This, in turn, means that entire channels are being kept from audiences and therefore not being allowed to grow. Realistically, this will get much worse before it gets better. I encourage everyone to share videos and channels they like widely on social media. This won't fix the problem, but at least it's a chance to keep conversations going. Alright, let's move on. When Jordan Peterson was interviewed by Kathy Newman, one of the points he attempted to make was in relation to the gender pay gap. Since Equal Pay Day in the US just passed, I have spent the last couple of weeks looking for information that could help explain either Kathy's position that the wage gap is a good indicator of discrimination, or Jordan Peterson's position that there are many reasons for the wage gap, and although discrimination certainly exists, the wage gap on its own is not reliable as evidence of discrimination alone. Kathy's position is not a new one. In fact, she used a wage gap figure that accounted for things like education and occupation. Too often, the wage gap figure is presented as the raw figure without any adjustments at all and used to make it look like the figure represents the pay gap for equal work. It doesn't matter if you take figures from the UK, the US, or even worldwide. It seems readily apparent that the argument is that the wage gap is discrimination, and eliminating it will improve the lives of both women and men. A survey conducted shows the extent of this misunderstanding. A YouGov poll showed that 71% of people surveyed believed the gender gap was the difference in pay between men and women doing the same job, and not the difference between average earnings regardless of what job they do. This is important because it shows that the misleading campaigns have led people to believe that women everywhere work side by side with men doing the exact same job, but the companies pay the women far less. Sexism exists. Discrimination exists, but the gender pay gap is grossly misleading when used as a tool to show how much sexism and unethical discrimination there is. Yesterday, I found a video from ABC News claiming that women make only 79 cents for every dollar men make, and showed information, including age ranges where the gap widened as age increased. It claimed that the gap was even worse for women of color and noted that Latino women earned 37% less than white men. It said that higher education didn't solve the issue, which infers that education level was adjusted for, and ends with a statement that at the current rate it would take 100 years for women to earn equal pay for equal work. Identity politics and the added intersectionality with women of color exacerbate the confusion, and naturally the last statement about equal pay for equal work clearly makes one think that 79 cents on the dollar and Latino women earning 37% less is already talking about the same job, but it's obviously not. I wanted to find something that attempted to accurately account for discrimination against women and came across an article by the Economic Policy Institute. The article appeared quite comprehensive and had sections specifically dedicated to answering questions about discrimination. It gave one wage gap, then adjusted the figure to be based on median wage as opposed to average wage, in order to be less susceptible to being skewed when considering very high wage jobs. It noted that the difference would shrink if they accounted for factors such as education, and also acknowledged it would shrink further, down to 8.4% when accounting for more factors, such as geographic area, work experience, union membership, and other things. The authors of this article rejected adjusting the raw figure, however, and explained how adjusting for those variables did not take into account the factors that influenced a woman's choice to hold that job. They felt that the raw gap then included all discriminatory influences, including education, guidance, expectations of parents, and expectations about work-family balance held by employers and society, and so on. When understood, the argument was that the entire raw wage gap needs to be used, because although women's choices accounted for some of the gap, the choices were a result of societal pressures. I found this interesting and a far cry from the demand of equal pay for equal work. Additionally, I found a common theme in much of the research. Claudia Golden, the Harvard economist, had published her study using the term temporal flexibility, which, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it basically outlined a theory supporting the idea that much of the pay gap is a result of women choosing flexible working terms over dramatic increases in pay. This was much more noticeable in key corporate positions that required 24/7 availability or 80 to 100-hour work weeks. She pointed to increases in technology that allowed positions such as pharmacists who integrated computer record-keeping systems to be substituted for one another. In effect, this job sharing among pharmacists allowed women to want the position, and the pay gap was diminished as a result. Golden's interpretation and approach suggests that changing more working requirements to allow for greater flexibility will then attract more women. It suggests that there is a choice being made by women, a choice not to pursue positions that require especially long working hours or positions that don't have flexible working terms, even if there are dramatic increases in pay. Now, you can argue whether or not women are wrongly influenced into making these choices, and that would be fair to some extent, but you would also have to be open to the fact that maybe the more free women are to make their own choices, the more those choices may be different from men. This is a common point brought up by people like Christina Hoff Sommers and Jordan Peterson. It is also supported in some respects by recent studies that show that countries with the highest rates of gender inequality have the highest rates of women graduating from STEM fields. That's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The conclusion of the authors was that life quality pressures in less gender-equal countries promoted women's engagement in STEM subjects. Women who lived in systems with less welfare supports and less equality pursued careers that paid more. This, for them, is one way to establish equality. Women from egalitarian countries, such as Finland and Norway, only represented 20% of the graduates from STEM field, where women from countries like the United Arab Emirates and Algeria represented over 35 and even 40% of all STEM graduates. Going back to the ABC News article, where their video is posted, they use two sources for their figures. ABC News says that one of them, PayScale, reports that women earn 78 cents for every dollar a man earns. They use the average of the American Association of University Women figure and the PayScale figure to arrive at the 79 cents for their own video. Going back to PayScale's site, however, brings up a lot of further information. They show unadjusted and adjusted figures. When adjusted for many variables, such as occupation, job title, work hours, geographic location, their figures show a greatly reduced gap from 78 cents on the dollar to 98 cents on the dollar. It shows the biggest difference is that women earn about 96 cents for every dollar a man earns in the transportation and warehousing industry, and gets all the way to 99.5 cents for every dollar in the tech industry. PayScale, as a company, makes and distributes software that allows employers to track gender pay gaps and works towards helping reduce these gaps. Their site includes useful tools, such as negotiation guides for staff that help teach women how to be more assertive and ask for raises. This is another thing that Jordan Peterson has touched upon in the past. When he discusses the Big 5 personality traits, he notes that women, on average, tend to be more agreeable, and this agreeableness may not assist them in negotiating their salaries. A quite well-known report with a foreword by the Department of Labor found an adjusted pay gap of between 4.8 and 7.1% and concluded that the raw wage gap should not be used as a basis to justify corrective action. The authors felt that the gap, when adjusted, may be almost entirely the result of individual choices. Again, there may be societal pressures involved in making those choices, but if studies show a correlation between freedom of choice and greater movement away from higher-paying fields, or further occupational segregation, this must be taken into account. In a sense, you would have to argue that once life quality pressures have been reduced, it is better to force women into occupations against their will than to let them freely choose based on their interests. Even without occupations as a consideration, differences in personality traits between men and women also appear to widen in developed nations. It appears difficult then to argue that the benefit of closing this gender wage gap outweighs the cost of forcing men and women into occupations that they have little interest in. While researching another video, I came across a study by David Lubinsky and others. This study tracked 13-year-old boys and girls who showed a near-genius aptitude in mathematics, and it followed them throughout their careers. Over 40 years, the men and women were surveyed, and strong gender differences were noted. They asked open-ended questions to determine what work preferences were held, and they found differences along gender lines. More men than women thought things like a high-paying salary, the ability to take risks, and a merit-based pay system were important, while more women than men thought things like working fewer hours, having a shorter commute, and work flexibility were more important. Once again, yes, societal pressure to comply with stereotypical attitudes across gender lines may be at work. But if you assume that all men and all women would always choose occupations at exactly the same rate, shouldn't there be a correlation between egalitarian societies and less gender segregation in all occupations? This just doesn't exist. I came across an interesting article published by a demographer working on a project at the University of Oxford. He pointed out that in 2008, the country of Bahrain showed a 40% wage gap in favor of women. Now, this is almost certainly due to having much fewer women working in the first place, and the women who were in the workforce were well educated and well paid. But it serves to show how the raw gender wage gap is independent of how well women are doing overall. In fact, the more women in the workforce generally means the larger the gender wage gap is. Now, radical feminists can argue that this is a result of patriarchal societies and an indicator of the oppression of women, but this doesn't align with the previously mentioned studies showing a correlation between greater equality and greater differences in outcomes. It also doesn't align with massive studies showing personality and interests vary between men and women, with women tending to be more people-oriented, and men tending to be more thing-oriented. This was just as true for an egalitarian country such as Norway as it was for Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. The demographer used a great example to demonstrate the weakness in assuming that closing the gender wage gap will benefit women in general. The graph shows a group of employees from a hypothetical company separated into 4 groups or quartiles. The groups consist of men and women. Men are represented by blue squares, and women are represented by orange squares. At the top, the quartiles have the lowest paying positions on the left and move through the higher positions as you go from left to right. Underneath the quartiles is a chart showing the number of men and women in each position within this example company. The solid and dotted lines represent the median and mean gender wage gaps. The closer the lines are to one another, the closer you are to removing the gap. Now, most people arguing for a reduction in the gender wage gap are arguing for more women to be hired in high-paying jobs. If the target is reducing the wage gap, however, watch what happens when women in low-level positions are replaced by men. You can watch as the orange dots are replaced by blue dots at the left end of the spectrum, without changing rates of pay, benefits, job flexibility, or anything else. This example company eliminated the gender wage gap entirely, and they achieved that goal by terminating the lowest skilled, most vulnerable, the most in need, and quite likely the group that contained the most minorities. Is that success? Sexism and stereotypical attitudes exist. Discrimination against women is a real thing, and studies do support this. It is critical, however, to keep the conversation clear and factual in order to understand where problems lay and work towards correcting this over time. One of the worst things that can happen is for the far right to show how wrong the message is from the radical left, only to assume that we can't do better as a group and not try to increase fairness and equity where possible. Another example of one of the worst things, however, is to fall into the trap that a raw gender wage gap shows a discrimination against women from a patriarchal, oppressive society. The gender wage gap is a result of many complex variables, and closing it might not even be a good thing at all. We need to continue to improve opportunities for women and look at ways to potentially change incentives in occupations to address flexibility, raising families, and other things that society finds important. Using the gender wage gap as a measuring stick or a target, however, won't do either. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a comment and hit that like button. If you didn't like it, please explain why. Open discussion is the only way to have a better understanding of differing views. Sharing this video on social media can help keep conversations alive. Now, here are a few other videos that you may be interested in.